Imanik's fingers no longer hurt. That was the worst sign. The pain had been the last message from his hands, the final protest from tissue that was still fighting. Now there was only a soft, numb warmth that felt almost comfortable, a lie wrapped in wool and seal skin. He was 8 years old, and he had been alone in the dark for 4 hours. The temperature outside was 62 degrees below zero, and the wind was moving fast enough to turn exposed skin to frostbite in minutes. His father had taught him something before the accident, something about cold that most people never understood. Most people thought cold was empty, a simple absence of heat. They were wrong. Cold was a force, an aggressive physics that came looking for you, testing every surface, seeking every gap, pulling heat out of anything warm it could find. His name meant ice walker in the old language, and his father had chosen it deliberately. The situation had started like 1,000 other days in the Inuit village. Imanik had been outside with his father near the ice shelf, learning to read the water, to understand where the seals lived. His father was a hunter who had survived 40 winters, and he knew the ice the way other men know the layout of their own homes. They had moved out across the white expanse, the snow crunching under their boots, when the pressure ridge shifted. It was a sound like a gun crack, a sudden fracture in the ice shelf. His father had grabbed him, but the shift had happened fast. The ice split, and his father fell through, dropping into the water below. Imanik had grabbed at him, but the current was pulling his father down, and the weight of the water-soaked furs was too much. His father's hand had slipped from his grasp, and he heard his father's voice one last time, not panicked, but clear and steady. Stay up high. Move toward the shore. Do not run. Do not panic. Then he was gone, pulled under by the current and the cold that kills in minutes. Imanik had run. He ran across the ice, but he ran smart, the way his father had taught him. He did not run fast. He ran steady. When he felt the ice shifting beneath his feet, he did not jump. He moved side to side, spreading his weight, keeping his feet flat. The young people in the village ran like animals when they were scared. His father had always said that panic was the cousin of freezing. When you panic, your heart races and your blood vessels constrict and your body shuts down the limbs to protect the core. It is the body's way of preparing for death. The key was to stay calm enough to think, even when everything inside you was screaming to run. By the time he made it to the rocky shore, the sun was already low. It was late September, and in the Arctic, that meant the light was leaving fast. He was wet in spots where he had fallen, and his mittens were soaked. He knew that wet clothing in this temperature was a death sentence. He needed fire, and he needed shelter. His father had given him a small pouch that he always carried. In it were a striker and some dried moss wrapped in watertight bark. It was the kind of thing that took up almost no space, but it was worth more than gold up here. Imanik knew how to make fire. He had practiced it 100 times, though never when his fingers were starting to freeze. The shore was rocky and exposed. He needed shelter from the wind. He climbed carefully, testing each foothold, his wet mittens already stiffening. He found a small alcove between 2 large boulders, a natural windbreak that faced away from the wind. The opening was maybe 6 feet wide, going back 4 feet into the rock. It was not shelter, not really, but it was better than being exposed. He started gathering tinder, dry grass in protected spots, the kind that grew low against the ground. He pulled it carefully, making sure it was truly dry. Wet tinder would not burn. He also gathered small twigs and driftwood. His father had taught him the hierarchy of burning. Start with the finest, driest material, then small sticks, then medium, then larger wood. Build the fire in layers, patient and deliberate. The striker was flint and steel, the old way. Modern people used matches, but his father did not trust them. He said that matches failed when they got wet, and up here, everything got wet eventually. The flint and steel were reliable. Imanik knelt in the alcove and arranged his tinder in a loose nest, a hollow space where the spark could land and catch. His hands were shaking now, and not just from the cold. He could feel the edge of panic trying to creep in. He forced it down the way his father had taught him. You acknowledge the fear, and then you let it pass. Fear is just information. It is your body telling you something is wrong. But panic is the body taking over, and that is when you die. He struck the flint and steel. Nothing. He tried again. The sparks were small, barely visible in the dimming light. On the third strike, one of the sparks landed in the tinder nest and began to glow. It was just a red point, barely bright enough to see, but it was there. He leaned down and blew gently on it, feeding it oxygen. The glow grew into a small flame. He added the finest twigs, then slightly larger ones. The fire was small, barely a foot across, but it was burning. As the fire grew, he fed it more wood, building it into something that could actually generate heat. The warmth was immediate and overwhelming. He could feel the heat on his face, on his chest, pulling the cold out of his body. He made himself eat some of the dried fish his mother had packed in his small pouch. His father had drilled this into him repeatedly. When you are cold, you want to sleep. But sleep is when your core temperature drops past the point of recovery. You have to eat to generate heat from the inside. Food is fuel. Without fuel, your body starts burning its own tissue to stay warm. As darkness fell, Imanik worked on making the shelter better. He used the largest driftwood pieces to prop against the rocks, creating a crude wall to block the wind. He lined the ground with dry grass and moss. His father had explained how cold works. It pulls heat from body to skin to air. But putting something between your body and the cold disrupts the process. Wool does it naturally. Air, if trapped, rocks slowly. The goal was to create barriers between his warm body and the cold world. By full dark, Imanik had a working shelter. He had a fire that was burning steadily. He had insulation. He had eaten. The wind outside was howling hard enough that it sounded like the rocks themselves were screaming, but inside his alcove, protected by the wall he had built, the wind was just a distant roar. The fire was working. His father had explained the physics of fire in the cold. A normal fire is inefficient. The heat rises straight up and is lost. But if you position yourself right, you can reflect that heat. Imanik had done this naturally, curving his wall so that the heat from the fire bounced back at him, rather than rising into the open air. He was, without knowing the technical name, using the principle of radiant heat reflection. The night was long. Imanik did not sleep. Sleep was the enemy. He sat and tended his fire, adding wood at intervals, thinking about his father's lessons. His father had taught him to think about cold, not just how to survive it. Cold was not evil or personal. It was physics, energy trying to find equilibrium. Your body was heat, the environment was cold, and the cold always tried to take that heat. The only defense was understanding. If you understood what was happening, you could make decisions. If you just reacted, you died. As the night deepened, the temperature continued to drop. The wind shifted direction, and Imanik had to adjust his shelter wall slightly. He used the last of his driftwood and then started burning the heavier pieces of wood he had gathered. He had learned long ago that different wood burned at different rates. Driftwood was light and burned fast. The heavier wood from the rocky shore burned slower and hotter. You had to balance them. Too much heavy wood and the fire would die down from lack of oxygen. Too much light wood and it would burn up in minutes. His fingers had stopped hurting around midnight. That was when he realized how serious his situation was. The numbness meant the tissue was dying. His father had explained this too. Frostbite happens in stages. First, you feel pain and cold. That is the tissues calling for help. When the pain stops, it means the cells are starting to die. The ones on the surface give up first. Imanik looked at his fingers in the firelight. They were pale, almost translucent. He knew they were damaged. He did not know if he would lose them, but he knew that sitting here, keeping them warm by the fire, was better than any alternative. Hours passed. The fire burned. The night held. Imanik stayed awake, stayed fed, stayed focused on the simple task of maintaining the barrier between himself and the cold. He thought about the idea that his father had mentioned just days before. In the village, there was an old man who had lost 3 fingers to frostbite when he was young. His father had sat down with Imanik and said, "That man survived, and he has lived 80 years since then. His fingers were just the cost, the price of not panicking when it mattered, the price of knowing what to do when everything was against him." Around 3 in the morning, when the cold was at its deepest, Imanik felt the urge to sleep growing stronger. His eyelids were heavy. He wanted to lie down by the fire and close his eyes. Everything in him wanted to let go. This was the moment his father had warned him about most emphatically. This was the moment when the cold had beaten him so thoroughly that he just wanted to stop fighting. His father had called it the false warmth. It feels like comfort because you are so tired of fighting. But it is the moment just before death. Imanik got up. He walked in circles around the fire. He did jumping jacks, something he had learned in the settlement school. He moved his body, forcing his heart to pump, forcing blood to circulate. He felt ridiculous doing jumping jacks alone on a rocky beach, in the Arctic night while his father was gone, but he kept doing them anyway. The dawn came slowly. The sky lightened from absolute black to dark blue to lighter blue, a process that took hours. As the light grew, Imanik could see the ice again, the place where his father had fallen. The hole was still there, frozen around the edges. There was no sign of him. The Arctic takes its own. There is no body recovery at 62 degrees below. The ocean is too cold and the body does not surface the way people think it does. His father was gone. When the sun finally broke over the horizon, it was just a thin orange line, barely enough to cast shadows. But it was day. Imanik had survived the night. He knew that people were looking for him by now. His mother would have sent people out when he did not return. They would follow his tracks. They would find him. All he had to do now was stay warm and stay awake until they arrived. He kept the fire burning. He kept eating the dried fish in his pouch, rationing it carefully. He stayed warm, and he stayed alive. When the rescue party found him, 7 hours after sunrise, he was sitting by his fire, watching the sky. One of the men, his uncle, rushed toward him. But Imanik held up a hand, the way his father would have. He did not stand up suddenly. He let them come to him slowly. Rapid movement could cause shock. Rapid changes in temperature could cause more damage. His uncle approached carefully and saw the sophistication of what Imanik had built. The fire, the shelter, the insulation, the wall designed to redirect heat. An 8-year-old, alone in 62-degree cold, had used principles of physics to survive an entire Arctic night. His fingers did turn black, 3 of them on his left hand and 2 on his right. Frostbite had taken the tissue, and infection set in during the long recovery. When the infection passed, the dead tissue had to be removed. Imanik lost parts of 5 fingers in total. The old man in the village, the one who had lost 3 fingers, came to see him while he was healing. He sat down by Imanik's bed and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Your father taught you well. I can see it in how you survived. He would be proud that you did not panic, that you thought through the problem, that you built yourself a shelter like a man, not like a scared child." Imanik had looked at his bandaged hands and said, "My father taught me that cold is not evil. It is just energy trying to find equilibrium. He taught me that panic is worse than any blizzard. He taught me that understanding the physics was survival. The story of the Inuit boy who survived the night alone in 62-degree cold spread through the settlements. People told it to their children as a lesson, not just about survival, but about the transmission of knowledge. They said it showed how much could be taught, how much a single parent could pour into a child in the years before tragedy. The hunters from the village changed how they trained their sons after that. They paid more attention to the teaching of shelter construction, to the explanation of heat transfer, to the philosophy of staying calm. They realized that the difference between the children who panicked and died and the children who survived was not luck. It was the presence of a father or mother or grandmother who had taken the time to explain the world instead of just protecting against it. Years later, when Imanik was a man, he became a teacher himself. He hunted, but he also spent time with the young people of the village, explaining the physics of their world. He taught them about radiant heat and wind speed and the stages of hypothermia. He taught them that their bodies were machines that followed rules, and if you understood the rules, you could survive things that would kill the uninformed. He showed them his scarred hands, the fingers that stopped at the first knuckle, and he told them that those scars were the price of survival and also the proof of his father's wisdom. The knowledge his father had given him had been enough to keep him alive when everything else had failed. There had been no rescue equipment, no emergency radio, no helicopter. There had only been the accumulated knowledge of generations passed from one person to another, compressed into 8 years of teaching, tested in a single terrible night. The legend of what his father had taught him did not fade with time. It became part of the fabric of survival knowledge in the Arctic communities. When hunters prepared young people for the cold, they would reference the story. They would say, "Remember the boy who built a shelter in the rocks. Remember that he knew what to do because his father had taught him. Remember that knowledge is the difference between death and life." The physical place where Imanik had survived became a landmark. Hunters would point to the alcove between the boulders and say, "That is where the boy survived." It was a monument to the power of patient teaching and the transmission of vital knowledge across generations. The fact that Imanik survived with permanent scars, with missing fingers, with the physical marque of his ordeal written into his body, made the story more powerful, not less. It showed that survival was not about avoiding all damage. It was about making calculated choices to minimize damage while maintaining the core function of the body. What his father had given him was not just information, it was a framework for thinking. His father had taught him that the cold was not a mystery to be feared, but a problem to be solved. That panic was the real enemy, not the weather. That understanding physics was more valuable than understanding luck. When the ice cracked and his father disappeared, everything Imanik had learned was suddenly relevant. Every explanation, every repetition, every boring lesson about heat transfer and wind patterns and fire management became the difference between life and death. His father had died, pulled under by the current into the dark water. But he had given his son the tools to survive that death. The knowledge that would keep Imanik alive long enough to be found. The message that the story carried through the generations was simple and profound. Survival was not random. It was not about whether you were lucky or unlucky. It was about what you knew. It was about whether someone had taken the time to teach you, to explain the world, to prepare you for the moment when everything failed and you had to rely on nothing but understanding. Imanik's father had done that. He had spent 8 years preparing his son for a single night that came too soon, in a way no parent would ever want. But when that night came, when the ice cracked and the world became hostile, Imanik had been ready. He had built a shelter. He had made a fire. He had stayed warm. He had stayed awake. He had thought clearly about the problem and applied the solution. He had survived, not because he was special or lucky, but because his father had taught him that survival was a problem of physics, and physics could be learned and understood and applied.